and then I'll post this. I'll post this later if you guys need to refer back to it. The class is not aviation industry familiarization. It's actually this is airport law. And the first night of class, I like to start out just by doing a basic background of what it is to run an airport. Um, very basics, because I don't really know where everybody starts at it. I know you guys have been in the program. Most of you have been in the program for 2 years, but it's hard to tell what kind of background information you have. And usually there's a wide variety of backgrounds. Some people have been working at airports. Some people have been around airports. Some folks are from the technical program. Some folks are from the professional pilot program. And so we're just going to start out with airport industry familiarization. So that way everybody starts out at sort of an even keel, and then we'll go into airport governance, because airport governance is interesting to me. And I can just tell you right now that there's really no difference in how the airport is governed, how we put on paper to govern it. There's no difference in effectiveness. There's no difference in ability to attract airline tenants. There's no difference in any regard whatsoever from the research that's out there. Usually what happens is how effective whatever the entity is that runs it is how effective the airport will be. So tonight I am talking to you all from Ronald Reagan International Airport in DC. Had a really cool day. Met in the board of directors of National Air and Space Museum downtown, and then got a backstage tour over at the Dulles facility for an airport project that we're getting ready to do. It's not on the airport project, it's a STEM project as part of the Arsenal of Democracy. So there's going to be 115 to 130 warbirds that fly over the Capitol in May to celebrate the anniversary of the end of World War II. And so we're doing a big program out there. So it was a really cool day. So it's a little hard to get up and excited about airport law, but hey, we'll work through it, right? So let's start off with just the basics of what an ACRP is. ACRP is an airport cooperative research program, and ordinarily they're done by industry professionals. Right now I'm working on one that has to do with state system planning. I'm part of the team on that. The panels that govern these can be industry professionals. They're usually state aviation officers, but there's a whole variety of these. I think there are over 200 reports now, and they deal with everything. So what they did on this one is they put out the question, okay, is there anything you could produce that would help us explain to people that aren't professional airport folks, people who have not gone through an airport program, whether it's an undergraduate, graduate, a certificate program, any of those. They haven't gone through any of that stuff. They've just gotten appointed to the airport. And I'll tell you, most of the time, the appointments to the airport board, what they do is they say, hello, Nicole, long time no see. I still don't see you. You're just a blank spot on my computer. Anyhow, so what basically happens is that whatever the governing body of the airport is, so it could be a city, it could be a county, it could be a whole variety of different things. Whatever that group is, they usually appoint people to the airport board or the airport authority or whatever the particular structure is. And so frequently what happens is somebody is a pilot and they'll get appointed to the airport board. And the analogy that I always used is that pilots, yes, a pilot, it's better than having someone with no aviation knowledge, but it's like one of us being put on a bridge board. I mean, we all drive cars, we all go over bridges, so therefore we're experts. Now, there's an echo. Now, how could it start on October the 22nd? If you started on October the 22nd, you wouldn't have enough time for the class to have 8 weeks. If you started on October the 22nd, you wouldn't have 8 weeks before you had the end of the semester. Huh. Because then you would only have, let's see, you'd have October 22nd, the class that week, 4 weeks in November, but you have 1 week off for Christmas. I mean, for Thanksgiving. Well, cool. It doesn't matter. If you want to stay on, you can. If not, this will be posted on the account for this course. So you're good either way. And I'll follow up with K-State to see what the deal is with the differences in the days. So you can either get a really good head start or you can fail. It's all good either way.
You're learning about. And then on the way home,
did I take care of the
you guys understand
echo?
What I talked about in the 3 axes. And they kind of give me yaw. And then I said, let's do this. Nice day.
Okay, so again,
this is something
like I said, the airport board, you get appointed to it because you're a pilot, especially in small towns, but it even happens in very large communities. You get appointed to the airport board. Hey, the person's a pilot, so they must know something about aviation, and so they get appointed to the board. But the reality is that being involved in aviation, the only thing you really know from being a pilot is that the FAA has a bunch of complicated rules, and they have rules for everything because it's just the way they like to do business. So you get appointed to the board, and then somebody needs to teach you how to go through and figure out exactly what it means to be on an airport board. There's several different types of airport structures, governance structures. So we're going to assume just for the moment that it's a city-owned airport. It could be an airport authority. It could be a county-owned airport. It could be a state-owned airport. It could be a federal airport. They still usually have a board. It could also be a joint-use airport. The boards for those are usually a little different because there's usually appointments to them. One of the weirdest boards that I ever worked with, and one of the last times I gave this presentation, was to the Strother Field board, which Strother Field is in Wellington, Kansas, or not Wellington, Kansas, Winfield, Kansas. Winfield, halfway between Winfield and Ark City. And the way that structure of that board is 3 members of the City Council of Winfield sit on it and 3 members of the City Council of Ark City sit on it. And then a member of the county is the ex officio member. Does anybody see a problem in all this? Yes, it's 3-3 on almost any vote that there's any friction between the 2 cities, so you have a pretty dysfunctional board. And you might ask yourself, now, why in the world would you put together a dysfunctional board? The answer is I'm not real sure, and they really weren't going to give the county commissioner a right to vote, so you were always stuck with this 3-3 thing. Anyhow, so the first section of the instructions that are given to the new board members is that of what their role is as a policymaker, which is really something usually that's pretty new to folks when they're appointed to a board like this. So we're going to go through these general perspectives first, and then there's about 4 sections, and then we'll move on to the actual airport governance, which is what the quiz for this section is all about. And for anybody who's joining us a little later, we're not sure if the class started tonight or not, so it doesn't hurt to be on. You're just ahead if the class starts later, and if not, I'm saving this recording and I'm gonna just post it into the class. So it doesn't hurt to be here tonight. And again, that's the lovely Ronald Reagan International Airport over my right shoulder. So roles and responsibilities. So a policymaker is that person who sits on the board. And then airport management and staff are the folks who execute the policy. So the policymakers establish the policy, set goals, they advocate for the airport, they usually appear before the governing body on behalf of the airport, they appear in the public for the airport, they sit on all of those oversight committees, and they establish the rules and regulations. What do the airport management folks do? Well, everything else. Anything they decide to do, we got to figure out how to make it actually work. So running the airport day to day is the role of the airport management group. One of the biggest things, as I said earlier, one of the biggest things that we deal with is that there is a whole lot of federal regulation on these subjects, especially if you're Part 139 airport, which a Part 139 airport is typically defined as one that has regular commercial service, although that's not necessarily the rule either. Most people that are non-139, that are non-commercial service, have let their 139 certificates expire unless they do some sort of major commercial traffic at certain times of the year, because 139 is a very difficult standard to meet. I'm currently located at, well, I'm at Ronald Reagan, but ordinarily I'm sitting at Lakeland International Airport. They have a 139 certificate. They keep up the 139 certificate. They're negotiating for air service, but really the reason they keep it up is because they have a number of sophisticated operations that happen at the airport. If you don't have to have a 139 certificate, like I said, a lot of airports have given it up. There are a lot of complications from that. And over the course of the course, we'll talk about what the complications are from giving up your 139. But all of a sudden, things that the FAA would have paid for in the past, if you are not a 139 certificated airport and therefore you don't need them, like fire protection, suddenly become a non-aviation activity. So you have a fire station at your airport, and you've been 139 and you've had all kinds of traffic, including the Air Force One has landed there. And then you decide, we really don't need this certificate because we don't have regular commercial traffic. Suddenly that fire station that the federal government paid for and may have even paid for some of the equipment that's in it is no longer a qualifying requirement, because if you don't have 139 traffic, if you don't have the 139 certificate, you don't need it. The vast majority of airports that are out there, there's like 5,300 airports total that are out there. In Kansas, for instance, there's 138. Of that 138, only six, maybe 5 at this point have 139 certificates. A lot of them have given them up. Great Bend, when they lost their service, they gave theirs up. I know Hutchison gave theirs up. The only reason that they really had it is they had a lot of test aircraft that came in and out of there, and then they had casino flights. So they kept it for those. But then non-regular activity, non-scheduled activity doesn't necessarily need the 139. So they just gave it up at Hutchison. There are other airports out there that have given up their 139 certificates. So that number is shrinking. But again, there are complications from that. And as airport management staff, you're supposed to understand those rules and regulations and what the implications can be. The biggest thing, though, that airport staff does is that they keep track of the finances. The financial piece is probably the most important part. It's usually tied to the federal government, not necessarily dictated by the federal government. A lot of airports, the federal funds are great, but they're not what really run the airport. On the other hand, there are some that really do need that money in order to survive. So what are the principles of governance? One of the first things that we have to recognize and understand is that most airports are government entities. And therefore, there are a lot of laws that apply to them that would not apply to them if they were private entities. So the Open Meetings and Open Records Act, that used to be a whole section in this course, and someone can write a project paper on it if they want to, but open meeting and open records apply because you're a governmental entity. So say, for instance, you get a request for your bid documents from your last project. There are rules that are actually governed by the Attorney General of the state of Kansas, if you're in Kansas or wherever, that dictate how long you have to tell the folks that ask for those how long it'll take you to get those records and how much it'll cost them for you to do printing or whatever kind of transfer that you want to do. I've dealt with some really interesting Open Records Act questions over the year. One of the key provisions of open records is that you don't have to produce a new document if somebody asks you for open records. So in other words, if you didn't do a bid tab that tabulated the scores, you don't have to create one. What I found frequently is that it's just easier to try and figure out what the person really wants and then to give them the document they're trying to achieve rather than to stonewall them. If you stonewall them and say, hey, look, we didn't produce that document, then you end up with additional complications. And so frequently, like I said, I've had some really weird ones, and we ended up creating a document even though we weren't required to. The open meeting, the reason open meeting is important is that if you have a couple of your board members who decide to get together, if you have a board of 5, suddenly a majority of a quorum is 2. So you have those 2 airport board members out in public, people see them out in public, and because that's enough to be a majority of a quorum, that ends up becoming an open meeting, which is really, it's annoying. I would advocate for at least 7 on every board so that at least it's then 3, because the quorum would be 4, so at least 3 to be the majority of a quorum. And that way you don't have to announce every single get together and everything is an open meeting. It's just easier that way. When you become a member of a board, suddenly your life changes because, as a CEO of a private corporation, so or the chief pilot for a company, you can receive gifts. It's no big deal. Nobody cares about it. It's not unusual when you're a charter, a charter pilot or, a chief flight officer for a fractional company for you to get a pretty nice bonus from one of your primary folks that you fly around all the time. If you're sitting on the airport board, that could be deemed a bribe. Suddenly your life has changed a lot because you are then in the public sector. So is it an appropriate, inappropriate gift the um, based on the organization that you work for? So the city will have rules if you're working for a city government. Sometimes it's the airport authority that creates those rules, but there are usually rules out there governing gifts. The reason that's important, the average airport fire truck has gone over 1.5 million now. So, you fly around the folks from the fire engine group, no big deal. They give you a big bottle of whiskey at the end of the year and say, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, whatever. No big deal. If you award them a $1.8 million bid proposal for a fire truck, suddenly, that $200 bottle of whiskey takes on a whole different meaning. The same thing goes for personal use of airport property. There are rules that govern. So I work for a private organization that's on an airport, and we have a tug that we use to move around airplanes. Nobody can say anything about it, right? Because the private organization owns the tug. As long as I'm complying with the rules for the private organization, what right do they have to say anything? So we use the tug to pull private airplanes out of hangars and so forth. If you're on the airport board and the airport has a tug, then all of a sudden you have to go by the rules that are established for the airport association or the airport, however they're governed. Personal relationships, financial relationships, those things all become sticky. Again, because it's usually a government organization. There are a number of airports around the country that are private that receive federal funds. There are few and far between. They're mostly in New Jersey just because of the way that the land broke out, but there are a few out there. So those don't have to have the same kinds of rules and regulations. Nevertheless, there are rules that govern when it is a government agency. And the primary reason for that is because of contracts and the appearance of impropriety if somebody's awarded a contract and there are personal relationships between those groups. There's usually laws that govern everything from who you can hire to the way that you hire them when you're working within a government organization. So it's important to understand those things and make sure that you're not violating those things when you're on the governing body or as the airport management and staff. And so I kind of like how this graph works. It talks about the airport management, the policymaking board. Those are the concentric circles that are in the inside. And then we have to deal with all of these other groups on the outside. And so it may be when you're a policymaker, it may be that you deal with some of these users and the advocacy groups and the regulators and so forth. Ordinarily, it's the airport management staff that deals with those organizations. They insulate the policymaking board so that there's no appearance of impropriety. And then the airport owner is usually a city or a county or a higher organization. And so again, it's insulated. So the airport management staff work with them first, try and resolve those issues, try and resolve any issues, try and make sure that the stakeholders are happy, try and make sure that the contracts with the tenants are all good. But invariably what you're going to have is you're going to have stakeholders that jump the process. They'll go straight to the mayor. They'll bring their complaints right directly to the airport board and so forth. Sometimes that even happens at the higher levels. You'll have the FAA will intervene directly with the mayor or with a member of the board. That's unusual. Especially in the central region, it never happens. The FAA usually stays in their lane, but there are some unusual issues where you will see it happen. It's just unusual, which allows the airport staff to manage and the policymakers to make the policy, and then the city to be involved when it's really necessary for them to be involved. So NIPIS, National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, we'll hear this about 6,000 times. You may have already heard it 6,000 times. I'm not really sure if you all are familiar with how that all works, but it's a big document that's published, and basically the FAA decides what really needs to be in the system, what doesn't, and how much it costs roughly to maintain the airport system. Like I said, I'm working on an ACRP that talks about state system planning. The state system planning is a big, broad overview of the state. that tries to determine what's really necessary. The airport master plan is a more on location specific system plan that talks about your airport. So the other big project I'm working on right now is the Nebraska Airport Economic Impact Study, which we call Nebraska Aviation Counts. And so as airport staff, and well, especially for the board members, you try and drill down on them the value, the things that are happening at the airport: corporate, agricultural, firefighting. I was surprised in Nebraska that about 70% of the airports, about 77% in fact, of the airports have air ambulance, air medical transport flights happening there. So they have 83 airports in their system. It's a little smaller than the Kansas system, but the vast majority of them need to be constructed in such a way that air ambulance can get in and out, because air ambulance is essential for them. So you have a ton of folks that are using those airports for that very critical need. But how much of that message has been effectively conveyed to their legislators? It's tough. Disaster relief. Louis B. Armstrong, I had a chance to tour Louis B. Armstrong right after Katrina, right after they'd ceased emergency operations. After Katrina, and it was amazing because that airport was converted to every possible disaster relief need you can imagine. They were storing food. They actually acted as a morgue, so dead bodies were collected and taken to one of the facilities within the airport. They did everything. They staged people. They housed people. There was a section that was converted to dorms. The airport has wide open space, so they could even put temporary housing on the airport. And there are a number of airports. The one in Hope, Arkansas comes to mind, but they had all of the FEMA temporary housing, the trailers, they had them at the Hope Airport at one point. So airports can serve incredibly powerful, useful purposes within the community, and it's important to be able to convey that to the community. And so how is that done? These are just some of the ways that folks have talked in the past about conveying that message out there. And again, like I said, this particular ACRP was developed so that part-time decision makers, the people, that pilot who's randomly appointed to the airport board, can actually communicate the need for the airport and the airspace. So I'm not really going to go through this with you guys, because you guys are going to have an ops class and you're going to do all kinds of other stuff. But so let's talk about the basic elements of the airport. So a lot of airports have fueling. A few airports have towers. There are two typical types of towers: FAA and contract towers. We have all kinds of stuff that can affect the environment, including de-icing and fueling facilities, snow removal, TSA, airfield lighting. You guys have seen all this stuff. There are a couple of agencies in Kansas. There are a couple of airports in Kansas that have their own police staff. So they are airport police as opposed to a regular community's police. It's just an interesting thing. As an airport manager, you may actually be in charge of a public safety department that includes police and fire and medical facilities on the airport. And then you have what really looks like a really big park department, because a lot of what you do is just mow grass. There's just a ton of extra surface area at almost every airport that you're ever going to be involved with, because you need to keep those areas from being developed. Typical activities at an airport, the way that the airport structure usually looks. We usually divide finance, administration, engineering, landside operations from airside operations, and then landside usually includes terminal building operations. So here's the next piece that's important in terms of our regulatory. There is a book out there that's called the Airport Compliance Guide. And does anybody want to take a guess at how many pages the Airport Compliance Guide is? It is 645 pages. At one time when they released the thing, I knew it was on almost every single page, because that's what we were in the business of doing, is helping airports comply with what the feds wanted. But it deals with everything from airport planning to project construction and how you have to deal with it. Mostly what it deals with, though, are the grant assurances. Typical airport master plan, you guys are going to have a class on this, or you may have already had the class about how the master plan works. And for the airport environmental class, if you take it in the spring, we will concentrate on a couple of the things that are on the airport master plan, including airport airspace planning, because it's important. If you don't protect your airspace, then you won't have any airspace. And then we look at environmental, construction and design projects, and so forth. So this is one of the first issues that you'll ever have to deal with an airport. I guarantee you, when you get out there in the field, is protecting the airport from obstructions to our navigational surfaces. And one of the things that makes this really difficult is that it's basically protecting for something you can't see. You can't see an airport's glide path. It just doesn't work very well. And then you have neighbors that don't understand why you're protecting for something you can't see. And the surfaces are always confusing. In fact, the Kansas Supreme Court had a case on airport surfaces, and the justices in the decision, it's the Kimberlin case. The justices in the decision said that while it was complicated, much like the IRS code, some people out there could understand it. And so that's always just stuck with me, that yes, the airspace surfaces, the imaginary surfaces, thank you very much for coming up, the FAA for coming up with a term that just isn't very helpful. The imaginary surfaces are so unusual that it's like the IRS code. And if you've ever done taxes, yeah, you really get that and understand it. So the cool part is that this ACRP, even though I think it was 2009 or 2010, some of these things are just not even an issue anymore. We are still fighting for sustainable development funds. That's always an issue. At one point, there was some discussion about privatizing all of the FAA stuff. That's not so much in the picture anymore, and they have started planning a little further out. We were sitting about 5 years back on our 180th continuing resolution to, it wasn't quite that many, but our multipleth, it was well past, I think it was 18. We were sitting in multiple continuing resolutions where we didn't know where the funding for building airports was going to come from, or even maintaining them. So that's not as much of an issue as it was in the past. Satellite-based navigation is sort of a thing of the past too. We're less than 6 months from the turn on of ADS-B. We'll see how that goes. There's still a lot of folks that have not complied. There's a lot of misunderstanding of how compliance works, but we'll see how that goes. And then trend in aircraft development will be interesting too, primarily because the development of drones and all of that have really accelerated the chance that we may actually have the Jetsons come to live with us. So it's possible that in the next few years we're going to have an Uber. Well, they talked about doing it in Dallas, having some pilot programs and so forth, which I thought if any place, you practice someplace that doesn't have quite that much congestion and things to fall on. But having Uber in the sky, so that'll be interesting. And that really does change the dynamics of how the airport works. It may help it. It may, so you may be able to have fewer airports that take larger traffic. It may really hurt it in terms of, congesting the airways. One of the first proposals from Uber and those groups was that they were going to do altitude restrictions through all airspace. And so they were going to designate a certain area below, 350 feet, which those things could operate in without having to comply with the other airspace requirements. Because, when we get to a big airport, usually what we do is we take from the surface to so many thousand feet because we don't like having things conflict in airspace. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there over the course of time. So where do we get all of our funding from? So this is so this is an ongoing issue that we'll talk about through the course of the course. What can we spend our money on and what can't we? And where do we get our funds from? Because there's a grant assurance that literally says we shall not divert funds that were generated at the airport to any other purpose. It has to be for aeronautical purposes. And that makes it really complicated. So if you're building a road into the airport, is that aeronautical purposes? And the answer is it depends. And so if you're promoting the airport, is that for aeronautical purpose? The answer again is it depends. So there's all these things going on there. We have our normal operating maintenance expenses, pretty familiar with that stuff. Where do we get our funds from? A good majority of the airports get their funds from the AIP program. It's about a $4 billion program across the country. So it provides a lot of funds to do airport renovations, to do airport upgrades, and so forth. In the state of Florida, it's fascinating because in Florida, the FDOT has more money to distribute to Florida airports than the FAA does. So your money actually stretches a lot further, and the Florida requirements for the grants and how it's used and everything else are much less strict than the FAA requirements. And so you can get projects done in Florida that you could not possibly get done in Kansas. And you can study things that are logical to study, but the FAA says that they're not eligible. And in Florida, you can do it, and then in Kansas, you'd have to come up with private funds to do it. You'd have to, well, not necessarily private. It has to usually be from your sponsoring body, if it's a city or a county or whatever, or from, again, state grants there. In Kansas, there's only $3 million that's available, or I'm sorry, it's $5 million now. There's only $5 million that's available for non-FAA eligible activities. So it's a, and in Florida, it's almost 400 million. Of course, there's a lot more air traffic in Florida, and they've adopted fees and requirements on all of those tourists that come to Florida so that they can generate that money so that it makes sense. Passenger facility charges have, they're one of the most difficult things to negotiate because the airlines always want to negotiate as small passenger facility charge as they can. I've noticed that a lot of the airlines have actually gone to telling you what your fare is before they tell you what the passenger facility charge is, which is, it is a tax. So, I get that. It's a little deceptive because you get I got a $50 fare, and then, there's $6.50 additional passenger facility charge, whatever. But it does generate a lot of money for airports, and that's how you usually see the renovations happen to terminals, is that it's done through the PFC charges. And frequently you'll get, so you have to announce it, and the airports can fight it through the FAA process. Usually, like I said, the airlines fight it, but sometimes they won't. When you're in a particularly bad situation in an airport, the airlines will sometimes be the biggest advocate for a passenger facility charge because it can only be used one place to help facilitate your passengers. And so bond rating, we'll talk about it. Airports are independently rated for their bonds usually. Usually an airport will run an airport reserve fund, which, they'll build up money to have projects. In terms of the AIP projects on smaller airports, every airport that's not every airport, but most airports that are in the NIPIAS get $150,000 per year that they can build up for 4 years, or $600,000 to use on a project. So a lot of airports are sitting there with that money banked with the FAA until they can get enough money to do a good sized project. The problem is that a hangar facility, 10-bay T hangar now costs about $1 million. So $600,000 goes a long way towards helping, but a lot of your discretionary projects actually cost a lot more than that. What happens is, say for instance you need your runway reconstructed. I think the ramp project in Wichita was Wichita's not a good comparison because they get cargo money and a whole bunch of other money, but I think it was $14 million. So if they were only collecting their $1 million AIP money, so it's big airports, the passenger amount is $1 million guaranteed. Small airports, it's $150,000. So if Wichita was only getting their $1 million there, it'd take 14 years to collect enough to get that. So the FAA gets money to distribute at their discretion. So there's a discretionary pot for the Midwest region, the 4 states. But then there's the guaranteed money, and then there's additional monies that go to particular things like cargo and so forth. So frequently they'll have to do bond and indebtedness to complete a project. So the Wichita terminal, they did a little bit of bonding there, particularly things like the concessions. Those things will pay back over time, but you had to build up a little bit of a reserve so you were sure you could do the project, and then you do a little bit of bonding, which is basically just a loan in order to make sure that you can do the project, you can complete the project. So I think this was 2010. It was $3.5 billion in 2010 that was guaranteed airport money. It's gone up a little bit since then, but not a ton. Like I said, we do have a little bit better idea of how much we have over the next several years. One of the things that the legislators in DC seem to be able to agree on is that we should have a little bit better planning horizon. Although they always wait until the very end to actually obligate the money. So, we know roughly how much we have to spend, but you never know for sure until you actually see what the appropriation is. So where does the money come from for the AIP program? It's fuel taxes and fees that are assessed for flying. So it's almost entirely user fees. The projects are, the eligibility for projects is dictated, is pretty firmly roped in by the FAA, and then you're hooked with those grant assurances at the end. All right. So as a typical business, we run it like a business. Wow, bet you're surprised by that. It's very difficult. It may sound kind of dumb, but it's very difficult to get airports to establish good rates and charges practices. It's hard to raise the rates on anything at an airport, whether it's hangars, whether it's the fuel flowage fees, all those things. It's very difficult. So when it says it's a good business practice, it's one that, yes, it's good business practice, but it's really difficult to get your policymakers to establish new rates and charges. One of the key things, especially if you receive federal money, is that the airport revenue can only be used for airport purposes. And so understanding the performance measures, putting out good minimum standards, which we will talk about, I think, in class 5. Those are important policies to have out there. What a minimum standard is, it says anybody who's operating in the airport shall meet these standards, and usually you have it divided out by what kind of business it is. So if you're a fueling facility, you will follow safety guidelines and requirements. If you are a flight school, you will follow the pretty much industry best practices, but making sure those things are in place. This is something you'll learn entirely in a different class. And then we will have a whole class devoted to what is airport revenue and revenue diversion, because it is super complicated. I mean, I know that these are they threw up like 9 rules of, this is how it normally works. But it's super complicated even for the lawyers. All right, so typically what's expected. Oh, ag operations on your minimum standards is really important. I've read some that the airport went out of their way to try and not put any rules on the ag operators, and that's just dumb. I mean, because ag operators, they're usually not fly by night, pardon the expression, but they have a potential to have a big impact, particularly if they have a spill or they have an operational issue. And again, if you've ever been around an ag operation, they will typically, because the engines it's more dictated by number of times on and off than it is anything else, cycles on the engine. They'll leave the airplanes running while they refuel, while they load chemical and so forth. So having standards on those is pretty important. The one that every airport runs into some sort of a legal challenge on, that has a service come and ask them if they can operate there, is skydiving. The skydiving group and the Lawrence Airport have been duking it out for like the last 14 years. They just can't quite figure it out. And in some ways, the skydivers get a bad rap. I've seen them operate off of pretty good commercial fields. There were busy GA fields that were tough to fly in and out of, but the skydiving operations were there because they had a good relationship with the airport. It is very difficult to get a ruling from the FSDO that says that skydiving would impede the operations of the airport. That's what Lawrence kept trying to do. And at some point, you just have to grin and bear it and see what actually happens. And then you have a much better argument about, what the rules and regulations should be for skydiving. Because the reality is that the FSDO is going to say, is that rule, is it reasonable? If it's not reasonable, they're not going to let you put it in place, because you cannot restrict skydiving because it is an aeronautical activity. Same thing is true with ultralights. I had an airport that wanted to establish a rule that said that the ultralights had to fly at a certain altitude in order to join the pattern, which the ultralight could not do. Really as a mechanism to try and prohibit them from operating there. It was a private field. And so then the question was, can you keep your public use status if you have that kind of an operational rule? And the FSDO said, well, we don't have any right to tell you one way or the other, but that does not, in our opinion, constitute a public use airport. So the FAA didn't have any real teeth to preventing those folks from putting that rule in place. The other answer, though, is that the airport itself doesn't have any right to regulate air traffic. And so if someone is operating below whatever it is that they've declared as their minimum altitude, then the airport cannot go to the FSDO and say, hey, they're operating outside of the safety rules and parameters. The FSDO will say, well, we don't accept what you've put in place as a safety rule and parameter. So in that case, neither party wins. And, so there can be regulatory action taken against the pilot. And at the same time, the FAA really can't force the airport to adopt a rule that's more reasonable. So it's fascinating. It's a weird part of the law, but it's one of those things you might run into. What are the grant assurances? There are a ton of grant assurances. One of the most important that you'll run into is that exclusive rights cannot be granted. There's a really interesting case that's brewing down in Wichita right now at Jabara, which would make a great project if anybody's already starting to look for their project and their presentation for the end. But that one of the FBOs is claiming that they were granted exclusive rights and that there should not be another FBO placed on the field. The problem is that is direct. If the airport actually did do that, that is direct violation of the grant assurances. Well, the airport manager has pretty much come out in public and said, we never did that. And yes, the airport layout plan does show an FBO only at one end, but that's because nobody ever came and asked us. If they came and asked us, then any of these other buildings could be turned into an FBO, and we don't have anything to say about it. So that is fighting its way through the court of public opinion. The answer on the legal side is that the existing FBO is just wrong. I mean, there's no way that they could have granted exclusive rights. It's strictly prohibited by the grant assurances and by the FARs. There's a grant assurance that says we will maintain the airport. It's smart. That airport operations are open to aeronautical activities. Again, no brainer, but it does end up becoming an issue. Protection of runway approaches. Whenever you get into a situation where there is someone that may obstruct the approach, one of the lines of businesses that defines the approaches will say, well, it's not a significant impact, and they'll let your approaches get mangled because when they look at an approach, they look at it from the position of pilot protection. So it's possible that we could go ahead and put that tall tower, but it's going to raise your minimums. Well, for us, for the airport side, that sucks. We don't want that to happen. But from the FAA side, they'll say, well, it's okay because it's not a significant impact. From the airports division, which is the side that gives us money, they'll say, well, you screwed up because you didn't protect your approaches. And even though the FAA, a different section of the FAA said it was okay, it's not okay with us, and we're not going to give you any more money. So it's really important to protect your approaches and just help your boards and everyone else understand how those things work. Compatible land use is another one. They don't want you to build stuff in there that eventually is going to complain about the airport. Sometimes the FAA is not in the best position to judge that, but usually we try and put in uses that are compatible. So industrial uses, manufacturing, businesses, and one of the ones that I fought for was a hospital on the airport, as long as they gave assurances that they were going to use state-of-the-art methods for controlling noise. And the reason that the hospital, it was great to have it there is because they were using the A taxiway to take, they would land the King Air and they would drive right straight over to the hospital and pick up patients, because that way they could maintain higher levels of trauma care available without having to provide it right there, so they can fly folks out relatively easily. Availability on fair and reasonable terms. So we do, when it's non-aeronautical, we have to charge fair market value. The federal government believes that we've subsidized at least a little bit the aeronautical uses, so we don't necessarily have to be at fair market value on aeronautical uses, especially if it'll drive additional activity at the airport. So what does that mean exactly? Well, we may rent to an aeronautical use for 25 cents a square foot, and we would say that's good because that's what the self-storage units across the street are charging. But we may charge something significantly less for hangars, because if we have hangars, then they're buying more fuel. If they're buying more fuel, the fuel flowage fee goes back to helping support the airport and also justifying the fact that the airport exists. So you cannot build anything that doesn't comply with the airport layout plan, the most updated version of it. That's a little complicated, but what happens basically is when they do the airport layout plan, it's sent through the 14 lines of business, and they get to make objections to it or not. So usually if it's on the airport layout plan, it's probably going to be okay. You must have an updated airport layout plan. They try to update them every 5 years, but if you're doing a major construction project, they're going to make you update the airport layout plan before you move forward with it. Use of airport revenues have to be used for airport purposes or aeronautical purposes, and they want you to have a payment prevention maintenance plan. In Kansas, it's great because the state does it, and the information's all available on the Kansas Aviation Portal, and so you can kind of take a look at that. I did a case a couple of years ago where there was a plaintiff who was alleging that the damage to his airplane was caused by the airport, and so I looked at where all that airplane had been, at least where I could tell it had been based on FlightAware and a variety of other sources. And it had been to a bunch of places with much worse pavement. So they tried to use the fact that there was a grant assurance on pavement preventative maintenance against the airport to say the airport was responsible for the damage to the airplane. And it turns out that airplane had been on pavement that was ranked much, much worse than where it was in Kansas, that they were actually trying to get out of a lease. They decided to sell their airplane, and then they were still stuck with the terms of the lease, and they were trying to get out of that by saying that the airport had damaged the airplane. So here's that, you really need to talk to the airport before you say, we don't want to have nighttime operations, skydiving, ultralights, banner towing, glider operations. Those are all aeronautical. Activities. You can have aeronautical crossover events. For instance, the activity that I'm involved with is a really big fly-in that also has an air show involved, although we don't close any of the airport runways or anything like that for the car show. We do rent the hangar space too, but we have, of course, security and fencing provisions. All right, well, so that was the first part, and we're gonna, if it's okay with you guys, we're just gonna bounce into the second part, and that way this recording doesn't go on forever. And the second part has to do with the reading that was pushed out on airport governance. And this is what the quiz is mostly based on. So basically you guys are going to get a big, well, that was weird. I wonder why that didn't share. You guys are going to get a big advantage over everybody else, because I'm basically just going to give you the answers to the quiz. Because you're here. I don't know if you're supposed to be here, but hey, you're here. So, isn't that cool? So, how are airports typically governed? There's usually so Salina, what does Salina have? Salina has an airport authority, and the airport authority actually runs the airport. And Tim Rogers is the whatever the head there is. I can't remember if it's president or CEO of the airport authority. And then his board is appointed by a number of different entities, including the county and the city, to arrive at his board members. Wichita Airport has in name the Wichita Airport Authority, but the city council actually operates in that position. So it isn't truly the Wichita Airport Authority. It's really the city council is the organization that operates the airport. And so how are airports divided up in terms of operating? This is for U.S. passenger service airports. So about half of them are single purpose entities. So in other words, that would be like the Salina Airport Authority. It has a single purpose to operate the airport. That's true even in a system where, what is that? That's true even in a system where, oh, okay. Really? Canvas isn't up? Because it's out and published and it should have sent out assignments. That is quite annoying, but you're way ahead, right? So there are others that, like for instance, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, they operate not only the airport, but they operate the train line, they operate a whole variety of stuff. And then general purpose entities are things like the city of Wichita. The Great Bend Airport is actually a city function. It's not an airport authority. The vast majority of airports are actually, when you look at the general governing process, the vast majority are run by cities. So it is a city department within the overall organization. Oh, I know what you're trying to do, Nicole. Were you trying to take the test while we were talking about it? Because it's open. Maybe not. Anyhow, the vast majority are run by cities. Then you have states. So in Nebraska, I think they have 3 airports now. They may have 4, but they were old World War II bases, and they're actually pretty well populated in terms of aircraft and so forth that are there on the airport. So then you could have a county. There's or a city county organization, and then there's usually a big other division here. So we have DOD has joint use airports. Sometimes they have public use airports that are solely DOD or federal government. The airport here is Reagan Dulles are, if I remember this correctly, they are owned by the federal government, but they are operated under they're operated under contract with the Commonwealth and Virginia and the District of Columbia. So that's a weird functioning program there as well. So, there's Dulles and Reagan are owned by the federal government, operated by an airport authority, but the airport authority is Commonwealth of Virginia and the District of Columbia. What a weird one. Some states operate airports. It doesn't have Nebraska on there because none of the airports in Nebraska are actually commercial service. They're just regular GA airports. So as we're going through and we're trying to figure out exactly how in the world airports are governed and what types of airports are out there, we know primarily there's airport authorities, which are usually single purpose, or we have some combination of governments that run it, but for the vast majority, it's a city or a county that's running the airport. So what is the biggest advantage or disadvantage of any of these? If you're getting ready to take your CM, the AAAE actually has opinions on all this, but for the vast majority, there's really no difference in what the system of airport management is in terms of the effectiveness of the airport. So you have a bunch of different airports out there, different types of airports, but it doesn't really matter how the technical governance is. That doesn't really matter. What really matters is the effectiveness of the body that it's involved with. When airports first started, there's a principle that's called public purpose. And that's what most of the fight over airports was about when we first started trying to found airports and get them started, because they started out in the 1920s, 1930s. And so, for instance, in Kansas, the Wichita Airport was actually run by the park department. And if you look at the statutes right now, the state law that governs how airports are created in Kansas, um, it'll say, a park department is permitted to put together an airport. Well, if you think about it, you had these large tail dragging aircraft, sometimes with multiple engines, that were landing in a big open field. And the way that they decided how to land or where to land was they would pick the direction the wind was, and they would land into the wind as just a big, huge, giant square. And in fact, there's a couple of the World War II bases that still look like that. If you get a chance to look at the airport directories, for instance, you'll see a couple of airports in Kansas that are way out there that are just these giant concrete pads. And the reason they had it like that is so that you could just pick the direction of the wind and just land. And so park departments, it was not unusual. The first airport in 1911 in Wichita was at the Polo Grounds or the fairgrounds. And the reason is because they would do exhibitions there. They already had grandstands, and they had a big cutout piece of property in the middle that they could land the airplanes in whatever direction they felt like they needed to land them. In terms of federal legal constraints, there really aren't any. The federal government doesn't really care how you put together an airport. It's usually more important from the local side. What statute is going to give you the ability to raise money so that you can have the airport. The only thing that the federal government is really concerned about is that you demonstrate enough control that you can actually operate and use the federal funds, and you can have someone who grants the grant assurance. There is an effort out there now to do some privatization. There's been some minor privatization at Midway. The Springfield Airport is pretty well privatized. They got through the system pretty quickly because everyone wanted to see if you could actually do a privatized airport. So there is one case in here that I want you to look at because there's an essay question on it. And it's a Kansas case, and it talks about the original founding of the airport. I'm trying to find the page reference here. Okay, so here we go. It's up here. Oh, that's all federal law. And we're going to spend a whole class on immunity. So, okay, here's the Kansas case. So when airports first started out, we see that the airport was allowed to use that they were allowed to use eminent domain, that all of the things that you normally use to get a public utility were granted. All of those things were okay. And the courts went out of their way really to say, okay, airports were new. It's the 1920s, and they're trying to figure out exactly what what an airport was. And so one of the first things that people would claim is that an airport was not a public purpose. Well, it's like a golf course is not a public purpose. We know now, 100 years later, that airports do definitely serve a public purpose, but you'll frequently hear that as a claim even today. It'll be one of the charges in a developmental case. It'll say, oh, the airport is not fulfilling a public purpose. It only especially general aviation airports, it only serves a private purpose. Well, the answer pretty uniformly since the 1920s has been no. It is a public purpose. Airports are a public purpose. Get over it. It is just like a utility. We're going to treat it like a utility. Now, this Kansas case was fascinating because what they said in it was that the statute was not specific enough in order for the airport to sublease the property. So this is in the early days. So we started out, we had two things: fixed-based operators and the flying circus. So it's great trivia question if you're ever at a AAA meeting and they go, oh, what is the opposite of a fixed-based operator? Well, it was flying circus. They would, they would just plant themselves wherever they were. There wouldn't be a fixed location. It's hard to even imagine that now, but they were operating out of farm fields and so forth. So the fixed-base operator wants to move in, wants to establish a leasehold on the airport. In the early this early case in Kansas said, no, you can't do that. You don't have sufficient authority under the statute to do that. And so they said, no, you can't do it. Well, like within a month, the state legislature said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you the authority to do that because we want to operate airports. We want you to operate airports, cities, and counties. It's a really funky system if you think about it. Almost everything that has to do with airports has a federal component to it. And yet we push back all of the responsibility onto these cities and counties and other entities, airport authorities, and we say, well, yeah, we're going to establish these loose rules. We're going to contract with you. The grant assurances are basically a contract provision. We're going to contract with you, and you're going to provide us with this great service, which is the airports. It's very unusual. It doesn't really make sense. We do the same thing with highways, except for the federal government contracts with a particular state, and then the state can subcontract with a city or a county to do highway improvements. But for the most part, it is the federal government contracting directly with the state government to provide this essential service. So we know from this Kansas case, first of all, that it's, operating a flying field is a public purpose. Second thing that we know is that if something comes up in the way that interferes with that what the state legislature can do is they say, okay, we're going to grant you these authorities. What happened years later, so this was before Kansas adopted its home rule statutes, which is chapter 19 in the KSAs, the Kansas Statutes Annotated. And what chapter 19 does is it says, look, city, you have the power to do whatever is necessary to do to be a city. It's called home rule. You're closest to the people, rule your city. As long as there's no law that applies uniformly to all cities, then you can go ahead and you can do what you need to do, get it done. And the state legislature isn't going to interfere with that for the most part. So this would be moot now because the city could just enact a charter ordinance and it could say, okay, we're going to sublease, which is an important change in the government structure in the state. And we're going to talk about that next week, about how the basic laws of how cities and counties and those sorts of things work, or in the next class, whenever that happens to be. So, interesting Kansas case, the state's legislature comes back along and says, yeah, okay, that was the rule. It's not the rule anymore. Functionally, what happens when you establish an airport authority is that you transfer whatever it is that are the rights for this city, you transfer them to the new airport authority, and then the airport authority operates on those transfer rights, because it's just another governmental entity. We don't require a whole bunch of additional action for the airport authority to operate. So let's look at the information that's out there in terms of what system works best. And the answer is there's no particular system that works best. So the first study that was done, it's a couple decades old now. Well, it's only 10 years old. The first one that was done was Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. They were having some problems getting some things done with the airport authority. So they throw out this study and they go, hey, so what is the best system? Is it an airport authority system? And the answer is, we're not real sure. So then Denver does it when Denver's trying to decide, should the city run that airport or should it establish an airport authority? Again, mostly based on analogy. They come back with the answer, we don't know. So then New Orleans does a study, and they find out that, we think that it would probably be better if we had an airport authority, but there are a bunch of cities that run very effective airports, including Atlanta, Charlotte, and Miami, that are not airport authorities. So, let's look at another study. This one was from O'Hare, I believe. It didn't really matter who owned or operated the airport, and that the result was not necessarily better management or less political interference. It was just a change. So what we basically get to at the end is that in bond ratings, the bond ratings matter, not enough so that it's statistically significant. Does it matter in terms of this? I think this is JD Powers. So does it matter? Yeah, customer service. Does it matter in terms of customer service, what kind of airport you have? And the answer is no, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is the kind of how dysfunctional the governing body is, the entity where the airport is located. So if you have a dysfunctional city, you're going to have a dysfunctional airport. If it's really regulated how purchasing and procurement all work, then you're going to have problems with that. If you go to a different system, you may find out that the reason that it was really complicated and difficult was that it was, that there was corruption in the system, or that the area that you operate in, like Chicago and New Orleans, that it's actually the environment that the airport is operated in that causes those things, and then you end up with the same system that you had before, because it's the only way to avoid waste, fraud, and corruption. So there's no real outcome that we understand for sure that that the different kind of system, whether it's an airport authority, it's operated as a city department, a county department, a state airport, or as a joint use airport. There's really no distinction in the way that the airport ends up functioning. And that is the end of that piece. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to review what I can see of what Canvas looks like and what the syllabus looks like and what you guys can expect for the course. And so again, this will apply whether or not the course started tonight or the course starts at some point in the future, because this is all just going into the, like I said, this is all going into the recording, and the recording will be posted. So as I look at the assignments are so, like, for instance, a reading for tonight was assigned for October the 8th. And this is how most of these readings will come up, is that there'll be ACRP. It says it's a publication blurb, but I'm just going to take you right. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't share. Hang on, let me share it. So, stop sharing. And this is, let's go to here. Okay, so this shows the reading assignment, what the pages were, 3 to 31, then you click on it, and it takes you directly to the ACRP, and then you can just view this PDF, and it just asks you some basic information, and you have to accept the terms, and then you can go right straight into download the full book. You don't have to pay anything. I love this course for the cost for textbooks, because the textbook cost is $0. All of the resources will be available either through ACRP or through other free legal sites. So again, you click on this, and then it'll come up down here, and then you just open it up, and you'll have your readings. And in terms of the quizzes, again, it says the airport quiz is published. That's interesting. It says it's worth 19 points. Anyhow, that's so weird. Shouldn't be 19 points. 20. Anyhow, so this is what the quizzes look like. The syllabus itself tells you exactly how the syllabus tells you how many questions and so forth each quiz is before you even have to open it up. The following entities may own and operate an airport that provides commercial service. I'm thinking the answer is all options. Eminent domain is, as it turns out, eminent domain is where it's actually provided by the let's look. Eminent domain is actually what's the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. It actually was presumed that eminent domain existed, and then the Fifth Amendment put restrictions to it. And so it says the government may not take property without providing their fair market value. So that was assumed that the government could always come in and take property, because when England was governing here, they just did. I mean, so they wanted to build a new garrison or whatever. They wanted to build a new fort, whatever. They just came in, they took it. So the Fifth Amendment put limitations to it and said the government can still do that. They could come and take it as long as it's for a public purpose, but they have to pay fair market value. And there are people that, I mean, so I've been through lots of eminent domain fights where people will say that there is an intrinsic value to property that we can't see, and therefore it is worth more than fair market value. But if you were trying to buy the property, you as a normal individual are trying to buy the property, nobody's going to loan you the money unless you're paying fair market value. There's a couple of cases that have made a big difference on that. If you're taking property, for instance, in Missouri, and it's going to be used for a public purpose, but that public purpose is transferring it to another individual, then you're going to pay twice the fair market value. So there's escalators in some states. There's an escalator in Kansas if it's being transferred to a private entity. If it's just the KDOT comes in and they want to buy the property so they can build an off-ramp, then the answer is they only have to pay fair market value, which makes sense because this is the government. We don't want to have to pay more than what it would have really been able to get on the fair market. And that is what fair market value is. So there's an intellectual argument against fair market value, which doesn't make very much sense to me because I don't want the government to be taxing me more than they have to because you don't want to give up the sentimental value on a piece of property that sits in the way of an off-ramp. So, have the opinion that you want to have. There are a lot of people that don't like eminent domain, mostly because they don't understand that the alternative to eminent domain is traffic jams. All right, well, we'll go through the rest of these questions and I'll check to see if the overall site is published. Overshot. Okay, so the federal government grants airports money and requires that the airport comply with the regulatory provision. This system is based on what type of law? And the answer is contract law. Basically, they're offering you a contract and you're abiding by the terms of the contract. Typical airport board member is selected based on, there's no standard for selecting an airport board member. That is absolutely the truth in the case. Like I said, they usually select pilots, and as well-meaning as pilots are, as a pilot, I didn't have any better sense of how the federal aviation regulations work than anybody else. I mean, I understood how the flying regulations work, but none of the rest of it. And I took over an airport grant, and I was like, whoa, this is just incredible. So short answer is 50 to 75 words. In ACRP Legal Digest 7, there's a Kansas case from the early days of airport development regarding subleasing airfields. In 75 words, 50 to 75 words, describe the outcome and how the outcome was addressed by the Kansas legislature. We just talked about that. In 50 to 75 words, explain the airport governance of the Wichita Metropolitan Airport Authority. And verify the system is not a misnomer with citations to reference. So you're going to actually have to look something up on that. Because we already talked about it's actually the city council, not the airport authority, not the airport board. The airport board gives them guidance and overview, but they're not the actual governing structure. 50 to 75 words, explain the airport governance structure of the Salina Airport Authority. So again, figure out how Salina's actually works. Find 10 airports and explain airport governance system. I don't care where they're from. They can be, I don't care. And you can find most of the governance just by looking it up. So one of the ones that I was involved in building from beginning was it's Pleasanton. I'm having a hard time with the name of the county it's in, but it's now the county's airport. It started out as the city's airport so that they could get additional funding for it. The structure changed. The county got the funding for it because the county was a little bigger. It changed the state match requirements and all kinds of stuff. Now it's back to the county. Anyhow, I don't care whose airport you choose. Just pick 10 and figure out what their airport governance system is. And then, based on the ACRP Legal Digest 7, which we just went over, what are the advantages and disadvantages of 5 governance structures for airports? So just go through and pick up stuff from that Legal Digest and come up with advantages or disadvantages for the governance. They're in that section where it talks about the studies that have been done that tried to distinguish one airport from another to try and come up with advantages and disadvantages. And in the end, the answer is that there's really just not a significant difference that's made based on the structure of the airport. It's you can govern it however you want to. It's really going to matter more about the airport, how the airport is run, and then the political system that's placed in the municipality. That's okay. Okay, so let's go all the way back to home here. Course status. It says it's published. Hey, it may not have been published. Can you guys see it now? Ah, okay. Hit one more button. Okay. Well, so we're an hour and a half in. We skipped our 2 big breaks, so we're going to call that good. I'm going to put up one more video that you should watch in order to gain your 3 hours for the week. So this will be published, and you can come back and refer to it if you have any particular concerns or needs. Otherwise, if the course does start on the 22nd, I'll go ahead and I'll come online on the 22nd. We'll do the second course, and that's weird. We'll do the second course, and we'll just go from there because the first course will already be published. So let me go over the syllabus real quick. All right, we'll go over the syllabus just here real quick. And the reason for that is that there's a couple of things that are different. First of all, you don't technically have to submit the quizzes until December the 10th. They're all due on December the 10th. It makes a hell of a lot more sense to get this thing done as you go along. You don't want to get behind. You definitely don't want to get to December the 9th and then decide that, boy, I should probably get this all done. So each of the quizzes is worth 20 points. The research paper is worth 20 points, and the presentation is worth 20 points. The presentation, and I'll post a rubric for the research paper and the presentation. The rubric will be the exact same for both. The research paper itself, oh, you know what happened? I just figured it out. They actually created 2 sections for this course, and this side of it didn't get published, where you guys are all populated at, because they were trying to do a strictly online course. Okay. No, I'll note that for the future. Anyhow, so the rubric will be exactly the same, and I appreciate you guys figuring out that it wasn't published. Anyhow, the rubric will be exactly the same for both, and there's a video that I published that is just awful. It's in the announcements, and you'll take a look at that and you'll go, well, if he thought this was okay, then whatever it is that we do for our presentation will be fine. But I want you to do the same thing. You can do it with just YouTube or any of the whatever the video sites, and publish a review of whatever it is that you pick for your paper. So your paper is going to be on a legal topic that has to do with airports. I don't have any more restriction than that. Legal paper on airports, some issue on airports. I get a lot of the Santa Barbara, a lot of the Van Nuys, those kinds of papers. That's all fine. It could be a more mundane issue. It could be guns in the terminal, because we're going to have a little section on constitutional rights and airports. It could be protesting at airports. It could be, if you wanted to do governance, that's fine with me. Oh, I'm thinking about setting up an airport because there's not an airport in my home community of whatever, and it would be great if they set up an airport. Anything, I don't care. Whatever you want to do, as long as it has to do with airports and law. Anything is fine. The one that still sticks out in my mind that was presented by one of your fellow students, who I think she's still there on the campus. She presented a analogy paper about why the airport was the prostitute and the FAA was the pimp. It was hilarious, a little off color, but she proved her points by taking the law having to do with prostitution and then applying it to the relationship that's established between the airport and the FAA, and the exchange of money for doing whatever the FAA forces you to do. So, I mean, do it on whatever, I don't care. Just make it about the law and the airport. As you can see in week 5, we're going to do a pretty lengthy session on revenue diversion. It is very complicated. And then in week 6, we're actually going to do First Amendment rights, Christmas displays, guns, et cetera, et cetera. Week 7 is basic law. So we actually have 3 sections on basic law. The first one starts in week 2. But we have 3 sessions on basic law, and that'll be on that one on week 7. That'll actually be respondeat superior, which is how the airport has liability for stuff that its employees do and accidents. The number one issue for airports is the same as it is for every other organization that has a business. The number one lawsuit insurance claim that's filed at airports is slip and fall, just like every other business in the world. Slip and fall, slip and fall, slip and fall. But nonetheless, we'll talk about liability for airports, agency law, employment law, et cetera. And then the last week will be minimum standards. So those are the rules that the airport puts in place for its tenants and for other folks that use the airport through the fence and so forth. So that is the syllabus. You should all be able to get to it by now. The only discussion that I have up is the familiarization training. So since everything's going to be available by video, nobody's going to have to do the familiarization training. And then the assignments are all out there and posted. And like I said, this is the introductory video for the course, and it is just cotton picking awful. So whatever you guys end up posting will probably be A material, because I'd have given myself an A for this just because I'm that kind of guy. All right, 90 minutes has expired. Does anybody have any questions, issues, concerns for the group? I'm sitting here watching the chat bar and nobody's saying anything. So over in Georgetown, thank you, Nicole. Over in Georgetown, there's this really great restaurant called Philomena's. And so if you ever stuck here and just take the Uber over, it's like 3 miles away. And it is the best Italian food you'll ever have. The only problem is that each dish is like 40 bucks a dish. But they're big enough that I've been eating it for 3 days now. So that is my recommendation. As soon as I get off with you guys, I'm going to go over there and eat the rest of my Philomena's. I was here today for the Arsenal of Democracy stuff, which is in May. So if anybody's looking for a little volunteer space right as you get out of school for the summer semester, I can hook you up. We're going to actually be backstage at, I think, the National Air and Space Museum at Dulles. And we're going to have a big STEM area for everything to do, from becoming a pilot to airport management to air traffic control, whatever. So it should be a good time. So, and you can always find me at eyoung@flysnf.org. flysnf.org, or see Edward Young at ksu.edu. I also gave you guys in the syllabus, I gave you my my phone number. There's no sense texting me after 10 p.m. Eastern because it all goes to do not disturb. But I usually get back within 24 hours. All right, and I see several people have said that everybody's all good, so we're going to just go ahead and close this thing out. And I appreciate everybody for logging on in spite of the fact that it looks like we may not have even been in class tonight. So you guys are way ahead. I would encourage you to go ahead and take the quiz while the information is still fresh, although you can refer back to the video. And as always, everybody starts out with an A in my classes. You have to work pretty hard to get anything less.